Hello, everyone. Welcome. It is a sunny, slightly chilly day here in Toronto, and I am so glad that you are here. It seems like it's been a long summer, but then it also feels at the same time that it's gone by very quickly. And here in Toronto, this long weekend is the last weekend before kids go back to school. Here in Ontario, the day after Labor Day has always been the day that kids go back to school. And I think more than ever, people with small children are really quite anxious that everybody is safe and getting back and getting the kids out of the home and being with their friends. And I am just so happy that you are here from all over the world. And it's just I every day I just got together with some good friends this week, and it's just amazing how um, this community has gone together. And I can talk to people in Australia, I can talk to people in England via Zoom just so easily, and everybody here has shown up. I want to give a shout out to Joanne. I think Deanna might be here. I had some sew sisters here in my studio yesterday, and we had such a phenomenal time just seeing each other. I mean, I could have hugged them all day. It was just, I love these women so much. These are the ladies that I went to Missouri Star with a couple of years ago, and we haven't seen each other for a year. And we had some games, we had some fun. God, we giggled a lot, and everybody was just who they are. It was just so nice to see those personalities again. So I hope you can actually get together with some of your quilting friends. And if you haven't, this is the time, this to go out and find them. Join a guild, connect with them online. Um, it is hopefully you're double vaxxed so you can actually get out and be with them. So before we start, I just wanted to have a couple of questions. One of the most common questions I get asked all the time is, what is a purple thing? And I was lucky enough to actually get one yesterday, and it's just this purple stick. And what it's useful for is when you are sewing, you often need a very, like our fingers are just so large, you want a very fine point to get in and hold those tails as they're going through those presser feet right at the very end. The presser feet can easily torque your fabric, and you don't have a consistent seam. So one of these things is very good for that. And what I'm realizing with this, it also has on this side a little 1/4 inch guide. I'm not sure if you can see that. A little 1/4 inch guide. I didn't realize that. So you can just have a quick check on your 1/4 inch seam. Now, I don't actually use one of these. I've never, what I've used in the past, you can use a cuticle stick. Um, I have used a very narrow screwdriver. You can use, of course, a stitch ripper. You can use tweezers, which also are handy for you to help get in and get some of that lint out of your sewing machine. But last year, I actually purchased what's called a stiletto. And if you've ever gone to a quilt show, there's probably a vendor there selling a couple of these. They've got beautiful woodworked ones. On one side is a stiletto, and on the other side is a stitch ripper. But whatever method you choose to use one that works for you. So this is wonderful, but it's also extremely sharp. Like, I have to keep this little plastic thing on top of it because it could puncture not only fabric, my skin. Um, but I really love the weight of these clover ones in my hand. These purple things are nice and lightweight. Uh, and they've got a little slot in the middle here for you to put it on a string so you can have it around your neck. Um, and then a screwdriver, you can even use a pin, but that's what a purple thing is. And I think it's in a lot of people's toolbox. The other question that I was asked this week, let me see if I've got it. I posted a picture on Instagram, and I was missing a block. I went into my room and I had all these blocks laid out and one was missing. And the first thought that came to mind was, oh my God, I hope my dog didn't eat it. I don't want to go through that whole thing of pumping his stomach and everything. But we also have one of those vacuum robots, and it turned out it had fallen to the floor and the vacuum robot moved it into the other room. But a lot of people identified that block as a disappearing 9 patch, and it wasn't. It was just that simple block from my Stash Buster 1 quilt. And here's just another version. We've just been making some quick ones. So it kind of looks like that disappearing 9 patch, but honestly, I've done both, and the Stash Buster 1 block method saves you so much time over the disappearing method. And I find often that disappearing, even though it feels like a party trick, it is often much more work than just sewing the blocks in a chain formation. So that's the answer to that one. Now, I've got a couple of questions that were just answered. Just before we go any farther, there's a new thing on my channel this week. It's called channel memberships. And if you go to my home screen, you'll see it's right beside the subscribe button, and that is join. And for a small fee, this is just a feature that YouTube offers. It's basically for a small fee. Not only does it help support my channel, but it gives you more access to me. So I'm going to be having behind the screen shots. I'm going to have a dedicated Q&A or a sew day or a stitch and chat once a month with them. I'm going to probably switch the dates because not everybody can get the same time of day. So maybe one will be a Saturday and one will be a Wednesday at 6 o'clock. Yes, and so it just helps me. It helps me, and you get more access to me. There's also some cute emojis, and there's some badges that will go beside your name. So I hope you'll check that out. And sorry, somebody has asked me, I'm not going to be able to pronounce the name, did I finish my pet portrait? And the answer is no, I have not. I very quickly, as I was doing it, I went to getting a new dog, and of course my life just went kind of haywire right after that. But I've been looking at it a lot the last couple of weeks. Not only did I have my interview with John McPhail on Karen's Quilt Circle, but I also have been just trying to tidy up things because right now it is we are just on a snowball into Christmas and the holidays. In my family, I have a lot of birthdays. We have Thanksgiving in October and Halloween, Remembrance Day, on top of all the birthdays and the anniversaries. So I just wanted to try and get my decks clear. So I am going to finish that shortly. I love this name, Jude the Obscure. Jude the Obscure has said that sometimes when with her sewing machine, she finds at the end that she has a couple of extra tails instead of 2. I would just she's found after investigation that she has a broken thread from the bobbin, so she can just pull that out. It's not a big issue for her, but where is it coming from? It can come from a couple of different ways. But basically, the thread is going down and wrapping around the bobbin one more time. And that can happen easily just when there's no tension on those threads. And it just gets caught on something as it's going round again. And that's where that extra tail comes from. So I would just do a little bit more investigation on how. I would possibly use a leader and an ender. That's just those scrap pieces of fabric or scrap or those like I use 2.5-inch squares, but you can just use crumbs as a leader and ender and see if you can avoid getting that in your work. Sorry. I'm just going to turn off my watch. I've got a conversation going here. Theater mode. Somebody has asked about sewing curves. And that's a big topic. I'm going to do a video on that. But the real key with sewing curves is that you've got to keep an eye on where the 1/4 inch seam is. We are so used to matching up the edges of our fabric and doing our 1/4 inch seam in from that. With a curve, you've got one that's on the convex and one on the concave. I might be saying it the wrong way. But you're focusing on where those, as you line up your fabric, you're lining up the 1/4 inch seam. You're not lining up the edges of your block, and that will make it go so much easier. And truly curves is just about practice. I now do it with 2 pins. I don't glue. I don't do the thousands pins, and it works really, really well. I do a pin at the front. I do a pin in the middle, and then when I get to the middle, I take that pin from the beginning and I put it in the tail. And curves go quite easily. So practice is 1, and 2, remember it's the 1/4 inch seam. It's not the edge of the fabric that you're worried about. Margaret Lowens has asked, do I have any tips for cutting big pieces of fabric when you only have a small cutting mat? And some people have a small space, so it's not just that they can't afford the big cutting mat, they just don't have the space to be cutting it. So the trick is to fold your fabric and just to make sure that your folds are parallel. So if you go back to my Stash Buster number 4, I had that problem. I had these long pieces and I needed to fold them over and cut them into parallel strips. So what I would do is I would lay my fabric down, take my long ruler, and line that up on one of the lines on my cutting mat, and then fold my fabric over on that. And I may have to do that again. I may have to line it up again on the bottom and then fold it back over top. But the key is you want your folds parallel to those lines and perpendicular to your cutting line. So that is the trick for cutting big pieces on small mats. Is there a different... Heidi Price has asked, is there a difference between basting spray? She uses Birch brand and it works great, but it smells awful. Is there a way to cover up the smell? I do not have a good variety of basting sprays in my history. I use 2. One is Aleene's, and I don't have the cans with me, but you can certainly see it in my video, how to make a quilt sandwich. I've got 2 that I use. And I don't know of the smell, so I would convert to one of those things. But make sure you read the instructions, because there's adhesive sprays that are used for many things, and then there's the adhesive sprays that you use with your fabric and then it washes out. So if it's got a bad smell and it's for fabric, I would think that maybe it's old. But again, I don't know your brand, so maybe somebody else can answer that question in the chat. Susan has asked, do I have to bury my threads when I'm domestic machine quilting? So if you're doing it on your home machine, do you have to bury your threads? So what burying your threads does is it takes your tail, and it's by putting it under the fabric, there's less possibility that friction is going to pull it out and cause it to unwind. If you've got a nice knot in the fabric, if you've done a little bit of back stitching on top, that might be good enough. My machine has a lock stitch, so that's pretty good. If you are, going off the edge on either side, you do not need to bury your threads there. I use it's called a self-threading needle, which is a little bit misnomer. I don't have it. It's so tiny that you can't see it, but there's basically an opening in the eye, and that is what I use. I choose, if it's in the middle of the quilt, I choose to bury my threads. Now, do I bury every single one of them? There's some days when I say I don't want to do this, but in general I do. And it's just one of those things that I actually do while I'm basting, while I'm putting on the binding, sorry. So as I'm going around putting on the binding, I'll see what threads are left over and I'll just bury them as I'm doing that. So I would recommend, but if you've knotted it, if you've got a sewing machine knot in it, and it also depends on the value of the quilt to you. Is this something that you've really worked on a lot and you want this to be a showcase, I would definitely bury them. But if it's just a dog quilt or a baby quilt, maybe not. Maybe not. Kathy White says she has a hoop frame and was wondering if she needed to baste or float the quilt sandwich. What would you do? I actually don't know what you're talking about. I'm sorry, Kathy. I don't have your machine, so I'm not really familiar with that is. I'm truly a beginner long armor, so I may not be the person to ask. So again, maybe somebody else in the chat could answer that question for her. Veronica Russell has asked, is there any basting sprays that don't come in an aerosol form? So if you do not want an aerosol, I would recommend the basting powder. Again, if you go to my video, 6 ways to make a quilt sandwich, I show how you can use that quilting powder. And I show many ways. There's 6 different ways there to how to put your quilt sandwich together. So if you don't want the aerosol, there's other ways to do it. Okay, so where are we? Donna Bradburn has asked how to make a quilt that is beach worthy. Well, if you're wanting to take it to the beach, I would probably go with one of those ugly fabric patterns because it's fast and easy. And you can just throw in a huge assortment if you're wanting to do blues or you're wanting to do it bright, and you can make it as big as you need to make it. And you don't need to worry about whether you get sand in it. You don't need to worry about whether it gets wet. It can handle a lot of abuse. So that is the pattern I would use for the beach. Now, if you mean something more by that, please put that down. Jay McGill has asked, I'm confused about seams and planning which way to press them. I am working on a project with 1-inch strips and the seams are so bulky that it's really stressing you out. 1-inch seams are pretty darn small. I don't know what level of quilting you are, but that is definitely a more advanced way of quilting. Normally when people are using the 1-inch strips, they're either pressing them all in one direction or they're pressing in the 1-inch seam. So it kind of just is a raised little bit, but it depends on the quilt pattern because that bulkiness can add to the pattern and make it almost like just a raised applique. So the trick is to make sure that your seams are straight. Do a really good ironing technique. That means you set those seams, you do a finger press to make sure that they're all rolled over, so there's nothing left in that seam. Because if you're using 1-inch strips, you're rolling over a quarter on this side and a quarter on this side, which leaves a 1/2 inch on the middle. So basically those seams roll around and they meet each other. So if your seams are not straight, they will overlap. So you want to make sure that you've got good technique and you need to iron really well so you don't leave anything there. I don't know whether you're using light fabrics or dark fabrics. There may be some management that you need to do there, but that is definitely something that you possibly need to stand back and just develop a strategy of how you're going to get through them. Without seeing the quilt pattern, when you start making your quilt, this is why I always say do a practice piece, because you learn so much just making that practice piece. You realize, oh, I've got to start pressing everything this way, or I need to press this way, or I need to make sure that this is super accurate, or these are the points that are non-negotiable, or I see that these colors, this fabric is going to show up behind this fabric on the back. So I'm going to have to make sure that I trim this really nicely. So you may have to step back right now and just reevaluate how you're making it. Are your steps going in the proper order? Are you going to the iron enough? Are you going to the iron too much? Are you ironing properly? Are your seams straight enough? Do you maybe need to use a leader and an ender so you make sure that you don't do curves, that your seam remains straight both at the beginning and the end? Those are the things that you possibly need to do now if it's driving you batty. The other thing is some of these steps just don't lead to your strengths. So you may not be able to do 3 or 4 hours at a time at this. So these are the type of things where you may need to use your 30-minute timer and just do it in 30-minute increments, and then step back, do something else, and then come back to it. Okay. Kathy Terrell has asked, she loves the straight quilting on the green quilt behind me. Is there any instructions anywhere? Well, this is just a simple log cabin block. I did it in a class with Mary Chappell at QuiltCon in 2019. The pattern is a very common pattern. So this is just a square. So I took it in a square, and what you do, I think this comes from Zentangle. I forget the name of it. And you just go, you hit this point here, and then it hits here, and then it hits here, and then it just goes around. And every single time you come in, I've come in 1 inch, and then it spirals into the middle. I was in too much of a rush with this one, and I ended up twisting my fabric a little bit. So just be careful to take your time. Is it Hayla? Maybe Hayla has said, I'm getting to the point where I'm narrowing down my quilting style preferences and still want to explore without winding up with a lot of wombats, which is a waste of money, batting, and time. I've been wondering if you have any tips regarding how to build a multi-use and flexible stash of fabrics. Do you keep a selection of solid backgrounds? And if so, what size do you normally buy? Do you buy in coordinating bundles or pick or choose as you go? Do you plan a project by project and just buy what you need? I really wish that there was one size fits all answer to the how do you build a fabric stash. But there's not. We all have different sizes of space to work with. We all have different ways we want to quilt. We all have different color preferences. We all have different skill levels. There's just not one answer fits all. I'm going to quote Angie Wilson here and say, make what you love. So use those fabrics that you like. Learn how to use those fabrics. I do not have the announcement ready for it on it, but I do have a color class coming up. Online class, look for that announcement soon, which might help you narrow down which fabrics you should be building your stash with. But there's no answer that fits everything. I do recommend that you do not buy any fabric more than a fat quarter or a half a yard unless you have a plan for it. I was talking with a woman the other day who she had a fabric that she loved, and she bought 3 yards of it and then 3 yards of all the other fabrics that go with it. But the reality is you spend all this money and then it sits in your stash, and it sits in your stash for years often before you get around to using it. And by that time, there are more other beautiful, amazing fabric collections that have come up. They just keep coming and coming, and some are being re-released. And if it's a beautiful red and white flower, there are going to be more red and white flower patterns that will come out, be produced in the coming years. So you'll always be able to find something that matches it. And not only can you buy brand new, but you can also put a call out on the internet and somebody else might have it in their stash that they'll sell it to you. So don't panic that the fabric is going to disappear. Um, I know what, just my own example, like with Tula Pink, I can remember discovering her. I didn't discover her until, um, or I knew about her until Elizabeth. And I was doubly excited about it because I love Tudor history. And here were these beautiful fabrics and colors. And I didn't even realize that I already had a couple of her fabrics in my stash that I used on quilts without even knowing it. But I was very upset that I didn't have any of her earlier ones. There were some, there was a raccoon that I liked, and there was uh, Parisville and a couple of other ones that were really clever. And Tula has some wonderful blenders and secondary prints as well. And this past year I've collected so many, and I have actually haven't bought much of her fabric in the last 2 years, but I have this huge stash of it. Like I was so panicky that I didn't have enough, but within a couple of years I had tons of it. So I would say 4 years I had tons of it, and I'm now looking for ways to use it up. So don't panic that you don't have all the great fabrics that have come before, because there are more great fabrics coming. And just to prove it, I cannot wait till her flamingos come out. Tula Pink's flamingo collection comes out. I just love that. Having not bought any of uh, her sewing one, her black and white one, her Zuma one, I didn't buy any of those. So let me see. Greetings from Yorkshire, UK. This is J.E. Adams. Just piping, or trying to add piping to. Okay, just adding piping to a cushion. I don't really have any advice beyond what you could probably get on a basic YouTube video. Um, Depending on how you're putting in your piping, whether you're going around the corners or you're diving it in, um, it can be a tedious process putting that in and getting it right. But I've done it. I often find using a zipper foot helpful, just to be able to snug yourself right up against that piping. And I'm not sure if you're making your own. Uh, yeah, it's been a little while since I put piping in anything. It's the corners which are the challenging part, and you just have to make sure that you give yourself enough piping to get around that corner. And what was the point that when I had it? It's really quite a wrestle. I took an upholstery class when I was doing the piping, and the real trick is just making sure that you have enough of it there in that corner. Otherwise, it'll pull. Yeah. Um, Let me see. Um, Before I go on any farther, people have asked me about um, the Alaska trip. So if you don't know, I am going to Alaska in May 2022 with Celebrity Cruise Lines. It's run through RGE Travels. And if you have any questions, just go to my website under events, and you can download the brochure, you can book it, or you can ask a question. And I was talking with the tour directors, Ray and John, the other day, and we have decided, we formed a Facebook group for anyone that's interested that can come into this Facebook group. And if they want to find a roommate, if they want to have more questions about what's going to be going on the cruise, this is where you'll ask it. We are going to have a Facebook Live on September 14th if you want to have any direct questions that night. I personally have never been on a cruise before, so I have a lot of questions of them of what to do. We've been talking about what we're going to do, and I was just talking with them the other day about making an excursion so we can visit some quilt shops, because I know there's some great quilt shops in Alaska. And if you have been to Alaska and you've been to some of those quilt shops, please let me know what we should do. So there was that. Okay, let's get another one. Another question here. Somebody has said that they've used the basting powder for their basting, but it puckered some of my quilt. Any ideas on why to do that? Why it did that in some places? Well, it has to do with just your technique. So uh, that I don't know how many quilts that you've done that way, but I found that it was best to work from the middle out to the sides, and it was best to work in rows, not in squares. So do a row and then press it this way. And you also have to do it both on the front and the back. And unfortunately, pretty well none of these methods will guarantee no puckers. You still have to pay attention. Some just pucker a lot less than others. So I found that the powder was very good. For me, the downside of that was there was just little grains of it that ended up um, on the counter afterwards. So I just had to be very strategic in how I sprinkled. But it's very much like sprinkling talcum powder or sugar over top of something. Um, and yeah, I did really like it. I did like it. And for small projects especially, I think it's a really good choice of doing it. Okay. How do you hide the thread in the beginning of machine quilting? This is from Joan Warlaw. Um, so when you're doing edge to edge, you just put it in the batting and the extra fabric off to the side of the quilt, and then you come onto your quilt. But if you're starting in the middle, what you do is you drop your needle down, and then you bring it back up and pull up your threads. Then you either do a lock stitch on your machine, or you may just go back and forth once or twice, and then you go forward, and then you bury them from there. So again, using that self-threading needle, um, that's how I would bury them, but I bury them afterwards. On my long arm, I bury them as I go along, but when I'm machine quilting them, I bury them when I do my binding. We're at 10:40 already. Just a couple more questions. Um, Veronica again has said she saw some fancy rulers in Amazon from Creative Grids that are made for squaring up flying geese and log cabin blocks. Are they worth the money? Well, it depends on how much of those things you do. If you go to my video on how to make the perfect HST and how to make flying geese, both of them show how you can do perfectly good results, and if not fantastic results, just with basic rulers. So again, it goes back to how much sewing space you have, how much you can afford to spend on rulers. All these pieces that you acquire for quilting take up space and require management. So make sure you are going to buy tools that you use often. And rulers are just one of those things that when you're not looking, they seem to have babies. Excuse me. With every quilt you seem to make, you seem to need a specialty ruler. I'm always of the opinion, try to use what you have. It's amazing what you can do with just regular rulers and masking tape. The trick, what most of those rulers are doing are trying to improve your accuracy by showing you where are the critical points. And you can easily do that on your own, on square rulers or long rectangles with masking tape or washi tape to mark those important points. Yeah. Nancy Cock, why does the self-threading needle make a difference bearing threads? It's a time saver. You don't, for people like me who have old eyes, You don't have to thread the needle every single time. So you've got these extra, like you may have two, you may have four threads, and the self threading needle. You just kind of put the threads in the slot, and then you uh, bury them in your quilt, and then you snip them instead of sitting there trying to get two threads through that eye. And it just is a time saver. It's a time saver. And if it's a time saver and it's easy to do, you're more likely to do them. Yeah. One other, did I have a couple of other announcements? I had an announcement. This is coming up to my 1 year anniversary of Karen's Quilt Circle. I cannot believe I have interviewed 24 people. My last one was with John McPhail, and we were talking about pets and quilts and all those quirky patterns that he has. And coming up, not this Monday, but the next Monday, I will have Emma Jones, and she's from the Vintage Sewing Box, and we are going to be talking about English paper piecing and slow sewing. And then if you've been watching my channel, you know that I've been getting together with Angie Wilson of Gnome Angel, and we've been talking about the 100 Days, 100 Blocks Challenge. We've been having a lot of fun there with the people participating in the sew along, and we will have our next one on September 21st. We are past the halfway mark now. It's exciting to see some of this come together. And I think I have time for one more question. This is Norma. Hi, Karen. I am planning to do an 1/8 inch binding for the first time. Should I square it up from the seam to 1/8 or a 1/4 inch and then trim? That's a really good point. The problem is the corners. So I normally sew at 1/8. You think, well, you can cut back, but if you go into those corners, you'll have too much fabric. So you need to use the 3-in-1 tool at 1/8 inch because you're just going to have just a small little bit, but that's a pretty nice, for the right quilt, that is a really nice little binding. Any more that I've left on the table? No. So thank you all for showing up today. I just have our next Q&A is actually moving. They're not going to be on Saturdays anymore. They're going to be on the first Tuesday of the month. And the next questions that I haven't caught, I will be keeping my eye on them and I will try to answer them. And don't forget, you can check me out on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest at Just Get It Done Quilts, or on my website, sign up for my newsletter, and